Hey guys, today we have Magnus Carlsen giving another free lesson to one of his favorite online opponents lately, the 14-year-old prodigy Andy Woodward. Today's theme, king safety is a little more important than winning your opponent's queen. You're going to see Andy giving it his best shot, sacrificing a piece, creating a dangerous attack, going straight for Carlsen's king, but Magnus knows how to defend, and then he knows how to come back with the sacrifice of his own. So let's get into this game and see how it all went down. Andy Woodward kicks off the game with d4, and what do we get from Magnus Carlsen? An old school Benoni defense. This opening is not nearly as popular as it once was, but it still rears its ugly head from time to time. Maybe Magnus is trying to catch his young opponent off guard with this move, offering him the pawn on c5, which if white were to take it and try to hang on to it, there would be some very serious strings attached. But Andy is unfazed. He knows just what to do. He plays the most principled move, d5, preserving his central d-pawn while gaining some space. Knight to f6 from Carlsen develops a piece with some pressure on the d-pawn. Knight to c3, now from Andy, blocks his c-pawn from moving up to support his d5 pawn, but it does support his e-pawn instead. g6 from Magnus, preparing to fianchetto his bishop on the long diagonal. e4 supporting d5 and threatening to expand with e5, hence the move d6, stopping e5 while opening the diagonal for the light squared bishop. Bishop b5 check now from Andy, developing his bad bishop, that is the bishop which travels along the same colored squares as his two central pawns. And after Carlsen's response, bishop to d7 blocking the check, he now has the option to trade off this bad bishop. But he does not do it. Why? Because trading pieces will only help the side who has the cramped position, and that side in this game is black. So instead he plays a great move, a4. If white were to capture, after a takes b5, black has uncramped himself a little bit, but he has activated your rook on a1, who's now eyeing up this a7 pawn, which is just a big fat target. So Carlsen does not go down that road. He plays bishop to g7. We have some normal development here, both sides castling, and now bishop to g4. Pinning the knight on f3 and clearing the d7 square for a knight. Andy grabs some more space with a5. And now we have knight to e8 from Carlsen. This opens up the eyes of the dark squared bishop and looks to redeploy to c7, which will come with tempo on the bishop on b5. So Andy preemptively drops that bishop back to e2. We have the knight c7, and then we have the knight d2 from Andy, offering the bishop trade to Carlsen. A little better here would have been something like queen to d3, because Carlsen needs to develop this knight, and he'd really like to develop it to d7. But if you were to play that now, you could play h3, and that pretty much forces the bishop to trade itself off for a knight, giving up the bishop pair like so. But with what Andy played, knight to d2, Carlsen gets to trade off his bishop for a bishop. And after queen takes e2, he has smooth development with knight to d7, although this position still does favor Andy a bit, having more space. But any slight edge he has now in this position, he immediately throws away with the move knight to c4. Something like f4 would have been better. What's wrong with knight c4? Looks like a good post. Well, this blocks the queen's view of b5, which means that Carlsen can get away with this move, b5, and it doesn't just drop a pawn. Now you can't just let this pawn duo remain here. That's way too much control and space on the queen side. So obviously, Andy's going to play a takes b6 en passant. After a takes b6, his rook is hit by the rook on a8. No, he doesn't take it. He plays bishop to g5. Now the rook's defended. And this is a nice move because you're eyeing up the e7 square. Carlsen puts the question to the bishop, and only now does he take the rook on a8 because it cannot be recaptured with the queen, lest you lose your pawn on e7. Therefore, Carlsen has to capture it with the knight. And after bishop to h4, he's taken two moves with that knight just to get it back to c7. But now Andy has an interesting tactic at his disposal. See if you can spot it. It's not winning, but it's interesting, and it leads to a very imbalanced game. That tactic that Andy spotted and executed was knight takes d6, taking advantage of the pin on the pawn. But it's not as clear-cut as it appears. White is not simply winning here because Carlsen has g5. And what do you do now, my friends? Kinda looks like Andy blundered, doesn't it? What would you play as white here? You're gonna lose a piece. What's the best way to do it? Knight to f5. Beautiful. The bishop falls, but guess what? Here comes queen to g4, threatening checkmate in one move, and there is only one defense. Knight to e8. Andy picks up the pawn on h6 with check. That bishop is not capturing, it's pinned to the king. King moves, knight to f5, which carries the nasty threat of queen takes h4 check, and after the king moves, d6 would be bad. This pawn is pinned. You can't take it with the knight because knight takes e7 check forces black to give up his queen. So the only defense to queen takes h4 check followed by d6 is what was played in the game, e6. Pawn takes, knight takes h4, and the material has equalized. Andy has 3 pawns for the sacrifice piece, and Carlsen's king is looking a little insecure. But Magnus is a masterful defender, and he plays a very strong move, queen to f6, eyeing up some sensitive squares, f2, d4, providing some possible coverage to his king by moving to h6. We have f4 now from Andy. Okay, maybe this rook can get involved. Maybe these pawns can do something. Magnus plays queen to h6. And what do you think he's trying to do with a move like that? Engine recommends g3 and then take out the knight on c3, damaging the pawn structure. But that's not the way the game went. No, we had e5 from Andy Woodward. It's a reasonable idea. You're depriving a knight from jumping into f6. You're stopping a knight from going to d6. These knights are pretty much shut out of the game by this move. Or are they? What do you think Magnus played in this position? Take a minute, look deeply. Knight takes e5 is a killer tactic. Andy immediately realized that there is no taking the knight. If you were to play f takes e5, queen to e3 check is game over. Mate in 2. After rook f2, queen takes f2, king h1, queen f1 checkmate. So, his queen is under fire. He has to drop it back to g3. And now we have knight to g6. Attacking this knight here. I suppose he could take on g6, but he's only got 2 pawns for the sacrifice piece now. So he's technically down in material. And so you don't want to be trading pieces when you're down in material. So he drops the knight back to f3, which unfortunately gives up another pawn, the pawn on f4. Why would Andy do this? Because he thought that he was going to get a queen with the move knight to g5 check. The king's in check. The knight is defended. The queen is attacked. What do you do as black here? This is your last opportunity to play like a genius. See if you can find the winning move for black in this position. Queen takes g5 check is the brutal queen sacrifice that ended the game. After queen takes g5, bishop to d4 check can only be met by rook to f2, or if king to h1, of course rook takes f1 is mate. So after rook to f2, there comes rook takes f2, at which point Andy Woodward resigned. And in case you didn't realize why, let me show you what black is threatening. If it was black's turn to move, there would be rook f4 check, king h1, rook f1, checkmate. So what can white do? You can throw in a check. King just goes to g7. You have no more checks, or no more checks that aren't ridiculous moves. What else? You want to try to give the king a square? Well, then we'll just go rook f5, discovered check, and win the queen. So a pretty end to this little tactical skirmish. Magnus once again proving his superiority by seeing more and more quickly than his prodigious young opponent, who gets a free lesson in how to play a game of classical quality at a blitz time control, which is what Magnus seems to be able to do. Although how, I do not know.